When we think about the great wars of the 20th century, we picture the monuments, we read the history books. But what if I told you millions of soldiers were just left out of that story? Well, today we're going to dive into this huge, forgotten chapter of our past. And this quote, wow, it just gets right to the heart of it, doesn't it? These weren't just anonymous soldiers. They were real people who were systematically stripped of their own identity, even as they were making the ultimate sacrifice.
And we're not talking about a small oversight here. The scale is it's staggering. Millions of lives, millions of individual stories, pretty much all erased. It's a number so big it's almost hard to wrap your head around, which, might be why it was so easy for history to just look the other way.
So that's the big question, right? Why? How does this happen? Because this wasn't an accident. This wasn't some clerical error. It was a deliberate process. And to really get it, we have to understand a much bigger story about empire, race, and how we choose to remember things.
Okay, so where does this all start? Well, it really begins with a pretty simple and pretty brutal calculation. As the 20th century kicked off, European empires needed bodies for their armies, and they turned their eyes to Africa.
I mean, just look at a map from around 1914. Africa was basically a patchwork quilt of colonial territories, all controlled by these big European powers. The continent wasn't seen as a collection of nations or peoples. It was a resource, plain and simple. And when World War I exploded onto the scene, that idea of Africa as a resource went into overdrive. Europe was facing this absolutely catastrophic shortage of manpower, and the colonies, they were seen as this huge, untapped pool of fighters and laborers, just waiting to be used. Let this number sink in for a second. Over 2 million Africans were mobilized just for World War I alone. Now sure, some were volunteers, maybe they were promised a steady paycheck or a bit of adventure, but so many more were forcibly conscripted. It was basically a continent-wide draft.
But here's the thing. Just because you were put into a European uniform, that did not mean you were suddenly treated as an equal. Not even close. On the battlefield, the reality for these soldiers was all about rigid racial segregation.
Everything was strictly segregated. You had units like the French Tirailleurs Sénégalais or the British King's African Rifles, all made up of African soldiers. But they were always kept separate from white troops and were always commanded by European officers. The whole system was built to keep that colonial hierarchy in place, even in the middle of a war. And you felt that inequality every single day. African soldiers often got the older, hand-me-down weapons, while European soldiers got standard issue. They were paid just a fraction of what a white soldier earned. And worst of all, they were constantly given the most dangerous jobs, like being sent over the top first to draw enemy fire. They were valued